Hello everybody, it's Sarah and today I am back with my final review of 2020 and that is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is the first book in the Between Earth and Sky series. And this was the book club pick for December for my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, and that book club is all about shining a spotlight on women writing adult fantasy because they are quite often ignored and quite often pushed into YA and quite often told that women cannot write adult fantasy and epic fantasy, which, you know, is bullshit. So if you want to join, I will have all the links to the book club, so Twitter, Discord, as well as the announcement video linked down below, so go and check it out. Also, the choice for our buddy read for January should have already been made, but as of my filming of this video, I do not yet know which book it is, but I'm sure if you go to the Twitter, it's easy enough to find out. So yeah, maybe we'll see each other again in January. But now back to this beautiful book. So as almost all of my reviews, this is going to be a spoiler-free review, starting with a little summary of a book. Then I'm gonna go into the negatives, although there's not that much negative about this book, just saying. Then going into the positives, and then as a little exception I have a bit of a discussion part at the end, not including spoilers of the book, not really including the book at all, but in general, but you'll see what that's all about when I get to it. So first let's start with a summary. This book, I have already tried in my mid-month wrap-up to summarize this book, and it's really hard to summarize. This is a pre-Columbian Americas inspired epic fantasy series. This is of course the start of the series. And in this book we have multiple different elements and multiple different characters that we follow. One of the characters is a sun priest in the city who tries very hard to hold on to power, but to also make things better for the people, for everyone surrounding her. However, there's some politics involved and so on. A second character that we follow is a man who has a prophecy to fulfill, and he is traveling over the sea to the city where this sun priest lives. And then the third character we follow is a young woman with magical powers that she keeps hidden, and she is the one bringing said man who has the prophecy to fulfill over the sea to that other city, and that's how their kind of stories intertwine. So now that we know a little bit what this story is about, let's talk positives and negatives. Although, since this was a 5-star read for me, there aren't really that many negative things. There is really only one big negative that I have, and that negative isn't really a negative for me personally. It's just something that I know a lot of readers might be bothered by. And that is that you're thrown into the story without an explanation. So you're really thrown into it like you're thrown into cold water. There's not an explanation for the world building, for the cultures, for the politics, for the magics, nothing. You kind of just pick up the pieces as you go along with the story, and at the end, just with a puzzle, you have a full picture and you understand everything. And for me personally, that type of storytelling sometimes really bothers me, because it feels like you never have enough information to really understand the story. However, within this one, it really didn't bother me at all. I felt like we got the information as we needed it, and because we only got the information bit by bit, we didn't really end up having any exposition at all within the story. And so that was just something that I found personally was well done. I found it wasn't necessary to have all the information thrown at you right away. I found it was good the way it was done, but I can also see people who like to understand everything right away being bothered by that type of storytelling. So I guess this isn't really a negative as such, but it's more it depends on the type of reader that you are. Also, something that depends on the type of reader that you are is that this is not told in chronological order. First of all, you have flashbacks, which, I mean, can be a staple in any epic fantasy series. There's nothing really wrong with that. But then additionally to flashbacks, also kind of the stories of the different characters aren't in chronological time. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but at the beginnings of the chapters you have these kind of time stamps a little bit. You have 19 days before convergence here. Convergence is when the big climax happens. And then in the next chapter it might say 20 days before convergence, but it's a different character. And so it can end up being a little bit confusing sometimes, but since the stories of the different characters do happen chronologically, it also doesn't really matter that much, because at the very end, when all the stories do come together, you don't have the confusion anymore. So these are the two things that I might see people be bothered by, but again, I personally wasn't bothered by it, and I in fact quite enjoyed the storytelling within this book. And then also I saw a lot of people complaining. I mean, I didn't see a lot of people complaining, but I saw some comments about people complaining that there is use of neopronouns within this book and that that is confusing, which I can just say it's complete bullshit. I mean, first of all, the use of any pronoun can be confusing. For example, if you have two characters using the pronouns she, her, and if you use she, her instead of the names too much, it can be confusing which she, her is meant at that moment. And I have to say, I personally, aside from the fact that I know that neopronouns exist, I am not at all familiar with the grammar surrounding neopronouns, and I still had absolutely no problem at all following the use of them, and I still didn't feel like I was pulled out of the story because of them. So like, if you had any issues with the use of neopronouns, just like, gotta say, you might be a bit of a bigot, just saying, you know? So yeah, now as for the positives, first of all, I absolutely loved the author's voice. I absolutely loved Rebecca Roanhorse's like writing style and way of storytelling. I found it really engaging. I found it drew me right into the story very quickly. This is the first book by Rebecca Roanhorse I have read, and I had absolutely no problems getting into the story, even though it is the first book in an epic high fantasy series. I just like was in the story right away and just so engaged right away. Then the next thing, I absolutely loved the setting. I absolutely loved the pre-Columbian inspired cultures and magics and religion and politics. It was all so interesting, and there was something that Rebecca Roanhorse did especially well when it comes to setting and when it came to writing the influences into the story. And I'm gonna try to explain what I mean, and I hope I'll do a proper job of this. But you know how fantasy, and not even just fantasy, but literature in general, is expected to have this very like European white-centered focus. And because of that, I feel like sometimes within fantasy, authors may feel the need to like overstate that this setting isn't European, or that this setting isn't white, that the characters aren't white, and so on. And because of that, when we have European settings, the authors often don't feel the need to specifically point out that this is a European setting, but it just, like, we know it's a European setting. That's what is expected, so to say. And because everything that isn't European isn't expected, a lot of times I feel like the authors might feel the need to specifically point out, hey, this isn't a European setting. And there's nothing wrong with that. I absolutely understand where this comes from and why this often feels necessary. However, at the same time, I very much enjoy it if I have authors, like in this case Rebecca Roanhorse, who writes in a pre-Columbian setting, pre-Columbian American setting, and who does not feel the need to specifically point out that this is a pre-Columbian American setting within the text. Of course, when you have description of clothes, it's gonna be obvious that these aren't the clothes that we expect in our typical medieval European fantasy. But the surrounding things, it's just like, it's made clear that this isn't a European setting without specifically pointing it out. And then also the same thing when it comes to descriptions of the characters. I feel like white has become the norm so much that a lot of authors feel the need to specifically point out if a character isn't white. And actually look at that within stories a lot of times. A lot of times you will have characters that are white who will never have their skin colors mentioned, but all the characters who aren't white will at least once, when they're described, have their skin color mentioned. And that was something that I noticed in this book as well. I think I didn't come across one time that the skin color was mentioned within this book. I might have overread some things though, because I gotta be honest, I don't read descriptions of characters that closely usually. But I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed it when authors challenge our norms, not by pointing out that something is outside of the norm, but by putting something outside of the norm and like not feeling the need to point that out. Does it make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyway, that's something that I really enjoyed within this story. But now moving on to the plot and the characters. First, the characters. I really loved the characters. I cared for them a lot and my heart broke with them a lot. Like, I especially loved, what was her name? I forgot her name already. Shiala? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name, but I loved the teak girl. I also loved that you kind of had an implied antagonism between some of the characters, even though it wasn't like directly antagonistic because the characters didn't really know each other. But even though you kind of sympathize with all of the characters, you know that the characters are like on different sides of the spectrum, so to say. Like, they have different goals in mind and they have contrary goals, and so they're gonna end up being antagonists, I guess. But yeah, I found the characters very memorable. My personal focus within the stories was on the cultural part, of course, because I'm me, but I still really thought that the characters like pushed the plot forward very well. And then also plot-wise, I like enjoyed a lot of elements of the plot. There were like parts in the political elements of the plot that are some of the parts that, you know, are the most anxiety inducing to me. Like, there's nothing that gives me as much anxiety reading when you have like someone trying to undermine the power of someone else by being really sneaky. And it just like, ooh, it gives me all the shivers. I hate it, but I love to read it. It's like, oh, so good and bad at the same time. It's horrible. But then also what I have to say about the plot is that this plot like kind of felt a little bit like a setup, but in a good way. Like, I don't really know yet where the story as a whole in the series is going to go. And actually in that way it's kind of similar to our last buddy read for my book club, which was The Bone-Shot Daughter by Andrea Stewart in November. But where I felt with The Bone-Shot Daughter that at the same time the plot within the first book didn't have anything really to give, and there wasn't really that much of a plot within the first book even, and the world wasn't properly set up and everything. I did feel like this book did a good job at setting up the world. It did a good job at having an engaging plot within this first book. It had a crazy ending, and like, if you're someone who doesn't like waiting for the second book, if there's even a slightly open ending, I would say wait for the second book with this one and don't pick it up yet. Because yeah, that ending is like left a lot of questions. Let's just say it like that. And yeah, aside from that, I love the plot. I really want to know where the series goes as a whole. Like, that's what I forgot to say. Like, with this one, I really want to know where the series goes. This one was good as its own story, but it also was really good in setting up the series without really telling us where the series is gonna go, which is what makes me want to pick up the rest of the series. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyways, I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I cannot wait for the second book. And now let's get on to the discussion part, which has to do with the acknowledgements at the end that Rebecca Roanhorse wrote. And with that said, I kind of regret reading this after I filmed my little rant about let's talk cultures in fantasy and why are all the structures within fantasy the same, and why do the main cultures within fantasy always have to be cultures that could be called advanced cultures and not the cultures that are colloquially called primitive cultures that used to be called primitive cultures. But anyway, within the acknowledgements and credits, she first talks about how most epic fantasy is European inspired, and she never has seen a fictional secondary world inspired by a pre-Columbian America. And while there are now a lot more worlds inspired by Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Asia, it still seems incredibly rare to find a fantasy inspired by the Americas. I think part of the reason is the persistent myth that the indigenous cultures pre-conquest were primitive and had little to offer when the opposite is true. Here were master architects who built massive pyramids that rivaled anything in Egypt, and created city-wide sewer systems when London was still tossing its waste in the streets. Here they built high-rises that housed thousands. Here they tracked the equinox, the solstice, and the movement of the heavens with stunning accuracy. They wove cotton and traded turquoise and shell and feathers and cacao along trade routes that stretched across continents. They lived and laughed and loved. They were, in a word, epic. And the first thing I want to say about this is that she is absolutely right. The cultures of pre-Columbian America are epic. Like, the Aztecs are epic, the Mayans are epic, the cultures that came before them were epic. I forgot the name of this one culture. I think it was something with T, but I forgot it, because for those of you who don't know, the Aztecs actually kind of were, I don't know if I would say colonizers, but you know, they took over other cultures themselves before they then were colonized by the Spanish people, obviously. And I also do not want to in any way criticize Rebecca Roanhorse for deciding to write this story and deciding to choose the Mesoamerican, the Central American cultures as her main inspiration for the world, because I don't know exactly what her cultural heritage is. She might have reasons for choosing especially these cultures. She might not have any reasons that are connected to her heritage. She's still completely valid in choosing these cultures. I want to make very clear that what I'm saying right now is not a whataboutism. I don't like being like, hey, look, this happened now, but what about that? I just prefer a lot more to say yes and. So yes, amazing that we have this book. And it would also be amazing if we had other books. And that was kind of my point within my little rant about structures in fantasy. And also why it makes me so sad to read that her argument why these cultures are worth writing secondary worlds about, and why these cultures, you know, are worth being called epic, is that they have architects and that they have sewer systems and that they can track the equinox, and I don't know what else she wrote, that they have trade systems. Because it just feels like even within BIPOC authors, there's already this thing internalized that you have to have a culture that can be considered an advanced culture, so with a differentiated social system, as I was talking about, with different jobs and so on, with great architects, with priest classes, with aristocracy and so on, that you have to have a culture that has all this to be worthy of being called epic and to be worthy of being the basis of writing this type of fantasy. And that cultures that don't have that, that cultures that have been called primitive throughout the ages, that in fact are often still called primitive, and people apparently don't see anything wrong with that, that these types of cultures somehow aren't interesting enough or aren't epic enough or whatever you want to call it to write a story about them, to have them as the basis of your fantasy? Why not have a culture as the basis of your fantasy that is a nomadic culture? Why not have a culture at the basis of your fantasy that lives in small villages and like in village communities? And of course, villages are often the basis of fantasy, but these villages often are then parts of bigger kingdoms and so on. And yeah, it just makes me sad, because I think when it comes to white authors, when they choose advanced cultures compared to primitive cultures, and I'm just gonna use these two terms now because, you know, it's how you understand most easily what I mean. I'm not saying primitive as in that's what I think they are, because, well, I think that our school system still kind of teaches that way, that there's like, you know, an evolution from primitive cultures to advanced cultures, mostly because of our focus on European history from like Stone Age to then civilization, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, a lot of cultures that are called primitive cultures correspond in their organization a lot more with the cultures that were part of European Stone Age and Iron Age and so on, rather than cultures that existed during medieval times or the Renaissance or so on. But yeah, anyway, what I wanted to say is that I think with white authors, the disregard for these cultures very much stems from ignorance about how amazing these cultures actually are and can be, and how complex they are. And just because they aren't as complex in some of the, like, you know, social systems, that doesn't mean that they don't have incredibly complex dynamics going on within the cultures. But I think on the other hand, and that is like pure speculation, but I have the sad feeling that with BIPOC authors, the disregard for these cultures that often are also part of their heritage stems not from ignorance for those cultures, but on the contrary, from having been told for centuries that their cultures aren't interesting, that they aren't as advanced as Western cultures, and so on, and that now they feel like there's no interest for these cultures, which might very well be true, but I wish it weren't like that. And I think if anyone will know how interesting these cultures are, and if anyone is able to write stories within these interesting cultures, it would be BIPOC authors. And so I just wish that, aside from writing more of these amazing stories with Aztec and Mayan cultures as its basis, or Chinese culture, Japanese culture, South Asian culture like Indian, Desi culture, or Northern African, Middle Eastern cultures, aside from writing stories within these amazing worlds that are based on BIPOC cultures but that happen to be advanced cultures, I hope that there will also at some point come a time where there is an author who says, hey, there's also stories to be told within cultures that for centuries have been regarded as primitive, but hey, look what these cultures have to give. These cultures are so incredibly amazing. And yeah, that's just what I wanted to say, and why specifically this like acknowledgement made me very sad, because it just feels like not just white authors have a disregard for these cultures, but BIPOC authors kind of have given up on them as well. And I don't want to call it a disregard, because I don't think it stems from the ignorance that white authors have, as I have said, but just from, you know, centuries of being told that their culture isn't good enough. And after centuries, you cannot expect it to not have any repercussions. So yeah, that was the second round, kind of to why are all cultures within fantasy structured the same. And that was my review for Black Sun. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Tell me your thoughts on Black Sun in the description box down below. Also tell me your thoughts on what I was just talking about when it comes to cultures in fantasy in the description box down below. I would be very interested to hearing your thoughts. And yeah, with that said, all the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club, as I said, are also down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!